Um, yes, I'm Mark Ferguson on behalf of my colleagues at the McMaster Institute for Transportation and Logistics. I'd like to welcome you to another edition of the MITL In Conversation Luncheon Series. And today our guest presenter is Mr. David Adams from the Global Automakers of Canada. The title of the presentation today is Navigating Stress in Canada's Automotive Ecosystem, Trade Policies, Electrification, and Supply Chain Resilience. So something very topical to what's going on nowadays. First order of business is the land acknowledgement. So McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Um, so as far as the In Conversation Luncheon series is concerned, we started these in 2022 through the important contributions of Louis Paul Tardif. And we're now into our, I guess, fifth calendar year of these sessions, these virtual sessions. So we've been going on for some time and look forward to doing them quite far into the future as well. I should note that on March 24th, we will be having another seminar, so two this month. And that will be Lindsay Kislock from Westac, who will offer a bit of a Western perspective on some of the supply chain issues that have been experienced, cross-border supply chain issues that have been experienced, especially in the last year or so. Now, as far as this presentation is concerned, it will be recorded. It's being recorded right now, actually, and can be accessed later on MITL's website. For the administration of this session, we'll work through the chat function, so feel free to pose questions through the chat, and we'll get to them after David's done his presentation. Now, just tell you a little bit about David, who we're really pleased to have today. David was appointed president of the Association of International Automobile Manufacturers of Canada, now the Global Automakers of Canada, in March 2005. He has been at the forefront of the association's thought leadership on automated and connected vehicles and both the ecosystem and regulatory environment for the advancement of these vehicles, and currently sits on the federal government's Car of the Future advisory group tasked with apprising the government of the issues and concerns that automated and connected vehicles pose now and in the future. A few other notes. David also serves as the director of the Automotive Business School of Canada at Georgian College in Barrie, Ontario, and as a director of the Traffic Injury Research Foundation of Canada. He's proud to serve as a director for the Foundation for the Study of Processes of Government in Canada and their key program, Forum for Young Canadians, which endeavors to teach young people from across the country about Canada's democratic history and the parliamentary process to encourage our leaders for the future. So, with that, I'll pass it over to David. I'm administrating his presentation today, so just let me know when you want to move on, David.
Sure. Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to undertake this presentation today, and thank you to all those who have joined in. Maybe if we can go past the title slide to the agenda. Just want to set out a brief agenda for you. So looking at doing a bit of a level set of sales and production trends in the automotive industry here in Canada, where we are, where we've been, where we might be going, which is probably anybody's guess given the turbulent times that we're in. Looking a little bit about the current trade environment, and especially with the focus on automotive trade. The favorite topic, whether we wanted it to be or not for the last year or so, tariffs and their impact on Canadian automotive trade. And then also looking at a little bit of electrification and the status of our propulsion technology transition, given everything that's been going on as well. And then, as Mark said, we'll cap that off with some Q&A. So I hope not to run too far into the program to allow enough time for Q&A at the end. Okay, if we could move to the next slide. So just a level set, next slide. Just want to put up this slide that shows historic and forecast production trends for the NAFTA or USMCA or CUSMA or TMEC, whatever you want to call the new trade agreement that we've had in place for the last, I guess, 6 years, commonly known as CUSMA in Canada anyway. And just to highlight in the yellow circle that last year our production was down about 1.2, and as you can see, significantly down from where it was back in 2018, 2 million vehicles, and I think the peak that we ever reached in Canada was around 3 million vehicles of production, and a lot of that really our I guess movement downward in terms of production can be attributed to a lot of the production moving to Mexico when the NAFTA was first signed. But it kind of gives you, at least this slide gives you an overview of in the CUSMA USMCA region, who's responsible for what. Canada, obviously being the smaller player, forecast to be the smaller player going out to 2032 with not much difference in the growth of our automotive industry here in Canada. And of course, that's also going to be probably likely subject to what happens in some of the other areas we're going to touch on today, notably what's going to happen with the review of the USMCA, the CUSMA agreement coming up later this year. If we go to the next slide. Just looking at production trends in Canada. This slide only goes out to 2024, but I've added the detail for 2025 just on the right-hand side there. You can see, in recent times, our production, peaked at close to, I guess, 2,500 or 2,500,000 units back in 2012. Again, just to reiterate, for total production was down about 6.9% last year. And, despite what some people think, that the Detroit automakers are still the most significant producers of vehicles in Canada, Toyota and Honda actually represented last year about 76.5% of all of the vehicle production in Canada. And that's maybe not a big surprise, given that I think folks are aware that the Ford assembly facility has been down for the last couple of years. We have the Stellantis facility in Brampton that was supposed to get a product that's been idled for the last year or so, and also, I guess importantly, the GM facility up in Ingersoll, the CAMI plant that was producing hundreds of thousands of Equinox vehicles that then was I guess transitioned over into BrightTrap electric commercial vehicle production, and that's stopped up there. If we go to the next slide, Mark. Just looking at the sales trends in Canada for the last little bit as well. Sales last year were 1.9 million units, and that was up, which is maybe surprising given everything that was going on, and affordability becoming an increasing concern for a lot of Canadians. And again, for the 16 members that I represent, the share of the vehicle sales was about just a little over 60%. Some of you may follow Javosi Automotive Consultants, and I included a comment from Andrew King, who's the managing partner over there, which I think is interesting that, it's was a good year last year, but it's roughly 7% below the peak of 2017. And just also the note that Canada's population has grown by, I guess more than 10%, grown from 4.9 million people since that period of time as well. So population growing and still selling, or maybe underperforming in a way in terms of our sales to population, which is maybe something to be concerned about as we move forward as well. If we take a look at the next slide, I just wanted to insert this slide also from Rosier, just to highlight just a changing market in Canada. And I think, if you were to wind the clock back to when I joined the association back in 2005, these numbers would probably be exactly reversed in terms of how our market has switched from a passenger car market to ostensibly a light truck market. And highest level that I've seen last year, 87, almost 88% of the vehicles sold in Canada were light trucks or SUVs, that sort of thing. And again, that has implications for affordability and pricing as well. But that seems to be the wheelhouse in which Canadian consumers are purchasing vehicles these days. If we move to the next slide, just wanted to touch on some of the trade elements. And again, all of these areas are probably going to be a little bit lighter than I might like them to be, because I could probably do a whole hour's talk on any one of these subjects. But just to touch briefly on trade, if we could go to the first slide. If you look at North American trade and just understanding the importance of the USMCA or the CUSMA trade agreement, exports to all of the countries from all the other countries were, $1.6 trillion. And then you can see in the squares below, U.S. exports to the other USMCA or CUSMA countries, Mexican exports and Canadian exports. I think the thing that I wanted to highlight, which is in yellow, is just, we I think in Canada, we think we're fairly dependent on the United States, and we are, but not nearly as much as Mexico is. So 85% of its, 83% of its exports go to Mexico. For Canada, it's 75%. And 33% of the total Mexican GDP is reliant on those exports. So I think when I look at that through the lens of coming up to a USMCA review, it suggests to me, as I've noted in the bullet points below, that Mexico's trade exposure to the U.S. is significant, and perhaps it makes Mexico a much more motivated party to secure a deal. And if you believe some of the trade press and dialogue that is out there at the moment, and it's consistent with, I think, how President Trump likes to negotiate. He doesn't like necessarily trilateral deals. I think if it were up to him, he would probably have two bilateral deals, one with Mexico and one with Canada. And indeed, I think that's the way, last time we did this, that's the way it sort of played out, that the U.S. worked on a deal with Mexico, and sort of Canada really had to pry its way in the door at the 11th hour to ensure that it was not only included in that deal, but also had some say in what the final product looked like. But I think that there may well be a real risk of that again. And indeed, from what I understand, the negotiations are already starting with Mexico, where there's not been really a schedule between Canada and the United States to start their dialogue. I mean, I don't want to read too much into that, because the issues that the U.S. has with Mexico in terms of landing on a review of the USMCA are different than those that Canada has. So I would suspect that there will be a series of different bilateral talks between each country, as well as some trilateral talks going on. But from what I've been told by officials, we can expect that most of that is going to be government to government. There won't be a significant amount of dialogue with the stakeholders, even though our federal government has already had 2 rounds of consultations on priorities under the USMCA coming up for the review. So I think the federal government should have a good sense of the priorities, not only of the auto sector, but also of all the other key sectors that would be impacted by um, sort of a renewed or an updated USMCA. 22% of the trade that does take place under the USMCA is automotive, which I think makes it the most significant chunk of the USMCA or CUSMA trade agreement. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go forward. Go to the next slide. This slide makes sort of just takes a different slant on things, given the seeming importance of China and certainly an important issue for the automotive industry. President clearly working to try and mitigate the influence of China and Chinese companies' parts, components, cars into the North American environment, which is part of the reason why Canada followed the US under the Biden administration in putting in place the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs to, I think, probably more importantly, curry favor with the American administration at the time than some of the other concerns that were raised, which related to cybersecurity and state subsidization and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, I think China is going to become an increasing concern as we approach the USMCA review as well, in terms of just ensuring that neither Canada nor Mexico is a back channel for U.S. parts or components into the U.S. economy. Of course, that may all change with, I believe the president is visiting China in April, and who knows what will come of that visit in terms of any sort of trade deals or what have you as well. But just to say that, trade with China is important for all three USMCA companies, but obviously it seems to be more important to the US than it is for the other countries. If we go to the next slide, just wanted to highlight the transition from NAFTA to the USMCA and actually how much of a more complicated agreement the USMCA is than the NAFTA. So there are many elements of rules of origin with related to light vehicles, different contents requirements by region, by product, whether it's steel or aluminum. And I think for the first time in any trade agreement, a labor content as well. So you can see some of the requirements in terms of those percentages under each of those lines there. If we go to the next slide, just highlights the change in regional content from NAFTA to the USMCA. So we went from 62.5% to 75%. And then on the next slide, as it relates to automotive parts as well, from 0 up to levels of 75% as well. So all that to say, an agreement that is probably one of the most, I think it is the agreement with the most stringent rules of origin, content requirements, and whatnot. I think that stringency has caused some problems, which I recall at the time when we had the first dialogue in terms of transitioning from NAFTA into USMCA, and the initial US approach was to, I think, look for 80% not regional content, but actually 80% US content in the vehicles. And obviously we landed someplace different from there, but I think that gives you also a bit of an orientation of where the US may be coming from as we enter this review coming up later this year. But I think if we go to the next slide, it highlights the challenge. Yeah. So, I mean, this is what we're trying to, the point we were trying to make back when we were renegotiating the USMCA, that really the more stringent you make the agreement in terms of content, the higher the content levels, in other words, the more difficult it is and the more complex you make the agreement with more reporting and whatnot, then what that encourages automakers to do is to essentially circumvent the agreement. So, what I mean by that, for those that may not know, the tariff rate going into the United States is only 2.5%. So, if you make the challenges with complying with the agreement so difficult and the reporting so complex, you may well have, and this is what we were suggesting would happen, which did come to fruition under the agreement, that you would have more and more companies just saying, well, attack with it. I'm not going to bother trying to comply with the agreement. I'll just pay the duty on those vehicles going into the United States. And those vehicles, the non-compliant vehicles, were principally coming from Mexico. And the problem that the U.S. administration had with that is that, reflectively, they realized, well, that is going to be very, very difficult for us, because then we don't know what kind of content is in any of those vehicles. It could have, a high percentage of Chinese content or any other content. You just don't know, because those companies are choosing to circumvent the agreement that was designed to cover off all of that trade. So I think my own view personally is that this was one of the reasons why the president wanted to put in tariffs, because it's maybe difficult to raise your bound most favored nation tariff rate, but you can apply the types of tariffs that the president has applied to effectively give that impact of increasing the cost, if you will, of market entry into the United States, and really forcing companies to adhere to or comply with the provisions of the USMCA or the CUSMA. And I think, despite the fact that there are tariffs that have been imposed, there seems to be, in a warped way, even though the president is imposing quite high tariffs on his CUSMA trading partners or USMCA trading partners, there are provisions for companies that are CUSMA or USMCA compliant under those tariffs, such that the impact of those tariffs is not as great as it would have been otherwise. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll slide right into the whole issue of tariffs then. So again, if we look at this next slide, trade deficits and the rationale for tariffs, I think folks can turn their mind back about a year, and Trump was suggesting that the reason that he needed to impose at least the IEEPA tariffs, which are the Emergency Economic Power Tariffs from 1977, was because of the trade deficits that have been consistent, and also, at least with respect to Canada and Mexico, Canada and Mexico both being apparently significant funnels for fentanyl into the United States. So Trump, again, in his own math, had suggested that the deficit with Canada was 200 billion, at least 200 billion, when in reality the goods and services trade deficit with Canada was actually 35.7 billion in 2024. And if you look at this graph, you can get a sense that given Canada's share of trade, it's actually a pretty minor player out of all of those that are listed in the graph in terms of contribution to overall trade deficit. But I guess it's the old adage of you know, never let facts confuse the narrative. If we go to the next slide, this is a bit of an eye test, and some of it might not be completely up to date because it is a little bit of an older slide, but it's just a reference point anyway. Last year, 2025, when the different tariffs were imposed and who they were imposed by. So majority of those tariffs being imposed by the United States, with Canada providing some retaliatory tariffs as well. And one of the areas where Canada retaliated was obviously on the auto tariffs as well, which is still in place. And our government, federal government, has worked I think fairly strategically to try to minimize the impact of the retaliatory tariff on vehicles coming in from the US, while still trying to make the point that US should not be tariffing Canadian vehicles. The 232 tariffs, there was a whole side letter under the USMCA that addressed 232 tariffs and suggested that the US should not have any recourse to implementing these 232 tariffs without first consulting with Canada or with Mexico, and that there would be actually a quota under which those 232 tariffs would apply. But maybe I'm cynical, but it seems to me that in a lot of ways the president doesn't really care what's written down in the trade agreement or the side letters, and that's the challenge that we've been living with for the last year, is that there is really just so much uncertainty and not much certainty that you can put in the in the words of the president when he either initiates a tariff or withdraws a tariff. The likely event is that he'll find some other way to implement a tariff, and that's what we've seen now. I think some encouraging elements arising recently from the U.S. With respect to trying to contain the power of the president to continue down this pathway of basically unilaterally implementing tariffs. Some of you would be aware that the House of Representatives, I think with 3 or 4 Republicans, voted against tariffs on Canada on February 11th. Largely symbolic, I guess. It wasn't going to go anywhere, but I think the fact that happened is provides some reassurance anyway. And then I think, of course, everybody will be aware of the Supreme Court decision that was a long time coming, that effectively struck down the president's ability to impose the IEEPA tariffs that had been imposed and that were, frankly, the basis of a lot of the trade agreements that had been struck with a number of other countries. So situation is now, I guess, is that there are a number of lawsuits that have been issued already where companies are trying to secure back refunds for the tariffs that were that were paid, I guess, because of the illegal application of the IEEPA tariffs. So I think that's going to be a situation that's going to be in front of the courts for for a number of years. And I think, as folks will be aware, I think as well, the president having, I guess, lost on that particular case, always had a backup plan, and he's now started to re-implement tariffs of 10. I think they've actually gone up to 15% under. I think it's another Trade Act provision. 122 is the provision under which those tariffs are being imposed. So continues to be a challenging world in which uh, no certainty and no horizon, I think, for any of the relief under tariffs. I think as far as autos were concerned, we've only been subject to the 232 tariffs. I shouldn't say only, but I guess it could have been worse. We had hoped that those 232 tariffs that would be resolved back in the summertime when there was at least dialogue on trying to, I guess, deal with those, resolve those tariffs. But I think many of you will recall the ad that the government of Ontario ran, principally around the Washington area, which got the president upset, and that ceased all trade talks. And from what I understand, there have only been some minor back channel talks to try and address the 232 tariffs. And at this point, it's our expectation that those tariffs will be now dealt with as part of the upcoming USMCA review this July. If we go to the next slide. I just inserted this slide. I got this from a Mexican colleague, actually, which is why the couple of points on the lower left-hand side are principally more from a Mexican perspective. But I think it sort of speaks to what China has done. So because of all the different tariffs, counter tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, they've kind of restructured their own exports and focused on moving more exports into both Europe and the Southeast Asian region. And as a result, I think New Mexico has benefited from that, and also Mexico's trade with Canada has also benefited from the situation that's occurred through the application of tariffs to both Canada and Mexico from its USMCA trading partner. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk more about electrification, but I'm going to limit it to a few slides. But there've been, I mean, if most of you would have been aware of the elements related to electrification here in Canada that were announced by the Prime Minister earlier this month, and happy to talk about those maybe in the Q&A session. But if we go to the first slide, under that, just wanted to highlight that batteries have always been one of the key challenges to bring the price of EVs down. It was always thought that by the time batteries get to about $100 per kilowatt hour, then they would be essentially equivalent to cost to internal combustion engine vehicles. Battery costs have come down, but come down sort of at a slower pace for the last 5 years or so. But we will see continued downward movement in the cost of batteries, and also development of new batteries as well. Solid state batteries are being pursued by some manufacturers, as are sodium batteries and that sort of thing. So battery technology will continue. We can go to the next slide. And also the battery range, just to highlight, keeps improving as well. So I think range anxiety was a big concern of consumers when they were looking at purchasing an EV, but the range of vehicles has increased substantially. You know, now I would suggest that the concern is not so much range of the battery, but it's more if there's an anxiety, it's charging infrastructure anxiety, focused on being able to charge your vehicle where you want, when you want, and ideally fairly quickly. Currently, even with the 350 kilowatt hour charging stations, those stations are some of the newer ones that are out there. They typically would take maybe a half hour for you to charge your vehicle from, say, close to 0 to 80%, which still for most people isn't fast. In an ideal world, and I think to get real sort of a ubiquitous uptake of EVs, whether it's in Canada or anywhere else, we're going to need to get to that charging solution that replicates filling your or almost replicates filling your gas tank with fuel, which generally takes 5 to 7 minutes, something like that. And that's not without the realm of possibility, because in China right now they're working on megawatt chargers that will do just that, essentially charge your vehicle um, from 0 to the 80% in 5 minutes. So we're getting there, but these are some of the challenges that are preventing, uh, I guess, greater EV uptake. And that, combined with the fact that the federal government, up until recently, all last year, they had revoked their incentive to encourage consumers to purchase vehicles, as did uh, British Columbia, and Quebec is winding down their incentive as well. So we really saw EV sales fall off a cliff, which, if you go have a quick look at the next slide, you can see in 2024, the share, since over the course of 10 years, 0.3% to 14.6%. But then if you go to the next slide, you can see, in terms of looking at battery electric, plug-in hybrid electric, and fuel cell, which I don't even think there's a bar on the graph for fuel cell, we ended up under 10% last year. So some of the initiatives that I mentioned that were announced by the Prime Minister earlier this year, one was to, or in February, or earlier this month, was to reinstate the EV incentive. It will stay in place for, I believe it's 5 years, reducing in terms of value each year. Doesn't cover the same breadth of vehicles as the original ISEV incentive covered, but will provide some incentive for consumers to take another look at electric vehicles. And the other major thing with respect to electric vehicles that occurred as a result of the Prime Minister's visit to Beijing was the announcement of the federal government allowing 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market. Just last week, the government issued a notice, the first tranche of those vehicles. I believe it was around 24,500, if I'm not mistaken, for 6 months. The allocation, the quota for those vehicles will be allocated essentially on a first come, first served basis. So that process is starting now. A lot of folks have different thoughts about the wisdom of allowing those vehicles into the Canadian market, given that we had both concerns from a cybersecurity connected vehicle side of things, and also the degree to which the state was subsidizing the production of Chinese vehicles. Those concerns seem to have gone by the wayside, and it seems like this, well, it was maybe more an inside baseball trade, if you want to call it that, in terms of securing relief for canola farmers and some of the seafood and, I believe, pork providers got relief on the tariffs that the Chinese had, retaliatory tariffs that the Chinese had imposed, because Canada imposed the 100% tariff on EVs. So as of March 1st, those tariffs on those products were reduced as well. So I think there's a hope that with the introduction of quota vehicles from Chinese, that will induce a lower price point for EVs to be available in the marketplace. And that, combined with the incentive, which won't apply to the Chinese EVs, I think the government's thinking is these two things might at least allow everyone to get a better read of what the true demand is for EVs in the Canadian marketplace. Next slide. This is the last slide, and then we'll go to questions. I was going to add a whole bunch about this issue here, but I think that would probably take another 15 minutes just to talk about this. The Persian Gulf War, I think, is going to represent well, it's going to represent a huge challenge for I think every industry, and it may be perhaps the auto industry, maybe more than others. When you look at what the president has done in terms of removing all environmental regulation, essentially in the U.S., essentially encouraging automakers to building, big fuel inefficient SUVs and pickup trucks. With the price of gas going up, that might not be a wonderful choice that has been made. Moreover, perhaps for Canada, this will assist in as the price of oil, gasoline goes up. It's going to go up in Canada as it will elsewhere. That may well serve as an inducement for folks to take another look at EVs, but this is going to send shockwaves, I think, all throughout the supply chain as well, and just make everything more expensive. And with automobiles already, sort of average automobile price north of $50,000, it's going to create just one more challenge and one more uncertainty for the automotive industry. So with that, if you move to the last slide, Mark, I think that is the cue for Q&A. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I can't see the questions, so maybe Mark, I'll just rely on you to act as the moderator there.
Yes, for sure. Thank you very much, David. Uh, I think everybody found that very informative. So yeah, we've got a few questions to start with. So from Barry, changing to the world of CAVs, what are your expectations for the provinces and territories to align the regulations?
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge, and I think I can speak from an automaker's perspective. There seem to be a lot of the automakers that are now maybe pumping the brake a little bit on moving to full level 3 autonomy, given both the liability and the regulatory federal government's going to have to try and take some more control. Provincial governments in terms of implementing and Barry, you might know the name of the connected vehicle piece of legislation that the U.S. has imposed, just to try and put some guardrails around, Chinese vehicles and where data goes and ends up and that sort of thing. So I think that's something that Canada is going to have to take a hard look at as well.
Okay, a question from Nick. Uh, Other than Toyota and Honda, are there global manufacturers looking to invest in manufacturing facilities in Canada? Who are they, and what type of vehicles are they thinking of?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a question I think our industry minister Melanie Joly has been asking a lot, which you would have seen if you've been following some of the discussions both with Germany and with Korea on the subcontracts. The industry minister has been trying to tie auto manufacturing in Canada with those subcontracts, and in essence, making the proposition that we'll consider the subcontract if you do auto manufacturing, and that pitch has been made to both Korea and Germany, and I think you've seen that in both cases. One just last week with Germany, there have been MOUs signed with both Germany and Korea in terms of more, and it's unclear what it is from the new news release, and I've not seen either MOU yet, but greater collaboration on things like electric vehicles and batteries and critical minerals and so on and so forth, and an allusion at least to vehicle manufacturing. But look, I mean, I think the reality is for any company considering putting a plant in Canada, it's predicated on having the unfettered access to the U.S. market, which, given our current situation, is not a guarantee. both unfettered access and no tariffs as well, which is going to be a challenge as we move forward. And more on that, I guess, as we get into the review. Realistically, you need a plant of probably north of 250,000 units to make it viable, and that plant isn't won't be absorbed by the Canadian marketplace. That's why whether it's GM, Ford, Stellantis, Honda, Toyota, any one of those manufacturers probably exports anywhere from 85 to 90% of their production to the United States. So that would be the case for any manufacturer coming to Canada, I think. The case has been made by others that, well, if they could just take over some capacity that's not being used, and you can, as I mentioned earlier, you can think of a couple of plants, the one up in Brampton, the Stellantis facility, potentially the CAMI facility in Ingersoll. Maybe that changes the equation a little bit, but to my mind, it's a little bit naive to suggest that, oh, well, just because, I think if you look at, say, Kia and Hyundai together, they're selling, call it 230, 240,000 units, that, well, that equates to an assembly plant. Well, maybe it does, but that's, maybe 15, 16 different models of sales, and any assembly plants at most probably going to be only producing maybe two or three different model variants. So long way of saying I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I'd be delighted if somebody proved me wrong.
Okay, the next one from Martin is perhaps more of a comment, but I'll see if it triggers a comment from you. Looking forward to hearing about what the industry is moving forward with, in particular around the Prime Minister's and our Premier's desire to rapidly deploy the potential solutions.
Uh, I'm not sure what solutions we're rapidly deploying. Well, I mean, look, I guess what I'll take from that is uh, I think one thing that the president's actions in the U.S. have has done is, in a lot of ways, given Canada, I think, a kick in the backside that it probably needed to both wake up a little bit and look at what we can do internally to make our own economy more effective and efficient. And I think you've seen principally Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, and others take more of an initiative in trying to uh, remove some of the interprovincial trade barriers, and some of those apply to automotive as well. One of my staff made me aware the other day of, it's a stupid little thing, but mud flaps. Provinces have different regulations on mud flaps on cars, and well, why is that important? Well, because when you put mud flaps on cars, then you influence the testing of that vehicle in terms of how it performs and everything else. So again, one little area, maybe a very tiny area where it would be nice to have some harmonization and uniformity. But the other area that I would say is key would be one of the announcements the Prime Minister made was that he um, was removing or stepping back from the zero emission vehicle mandate in Canada, electric vehicle availability standard that was put in place that required automakers to deploy certain percentage of zero emission vehicles. And he's moved back to what we've traditionally worked with, which is greenhouse gas targets. Problem is that Quebec and BC still have their own provincial zero emission vehicle mandates. And from an automaker's perspective, it would be, I think, in our best interest, be very helpful for everybody if both of those provinces decided to back away from their own zero emission vehicle mandates as well and align with what the federal government is doing, which is developing more stringent greenhouse gas emission targets moving forward, which will, sure, encourage more electrification, perhaps equivalent to what the ZEV mandate would have done, but it will give more flexibility to the vehicle manufacturers in terms of how they meet those targets. So it's not as technologically prescriptive as the ZEV mandate was.
A question from Ken. He's curious about how Canada manages the difference in direction between the US and the EU regarding EV adoption and production, given recent emphasis on electrification in Canada.
I think this is going to be an interesting story to watch unfold because I think uh, what the Canadian government has tried to do, I think, is tried to thread the needle to still allow Canada to the overused Wayne Gretzky quote of go to where or move to where the puck is going as opposed to where it's been, which is the reality of where Europe and largely the rest of the world is at is moving towards greater electrification. Certainly not at the same pace as everybody was maybe anticipating, but that's the way the world is going. And at the same time, we've had, as I mentioned earlier, President Trump, abandoning a lot of the incentives and programs, both for consumers and for industry, for automakers to invest in EVs. Abandoning the endangerment finding under the EPA, which called or which validated that CO2 was a pollutant, putting the squeeze on California to eliminate their ability to set their own regulations. So all of these things are basically going in a direction that's different than where Canada, I think, wants to go and probably should go. So now we're in a situation where instead of, as we traditionally have done, is followed the US on their development of their emission standards, Canada is in a way having to forge their own way and developing their own unique emission standards, which, as you said in the question, I guess, Mark, will probably more likely replicate something closer to what Europe is doing. But I mean, Europe is experiencing its own challenges where the manufacturers there are having their own challenges meeting those standards too. So our admonition to the government is whatever standards are put in place, that we have a sort of a continual review process, so we don't run into the situation where we're realizing at the 11th hour that, oh, guess what, everybody, we're not going to be able to make these standards, which is not helpful for either industry or government.
Question from Maria. What are your forecasts regarding development of electric engines, particularly battery electric vehicles, uh, in relation to recent U.S. Supreme Court decision about tariff?
Um, I think Canada that provides an opportunity for Canada and some of the expertise that Canada has, and I think in terms of harkening back to one of the other questions in terms of what investment could come. I suspect if any, well, not if any, but some of the investment will certainly be around this type of investment around battery components, electric motors, all of this sort of thing that supports that whole EV ecosystem. I know there are many that are thinking that Canada and Ontario notably, perhaps a little bit of Quebec, made the wrong bet on sort of putting all the chips in the center of the table, looking at EVs. I don't think that's the case, but it's going to be a slower process, and we've seen either some of those projects that were announced under the whatever $50 billion of investment that we secured back a couple of years ago, some of those projects not moving forward, some of them being put on hold, and some new ones being announced. So I don't think that the EV transition or the EV ecosystem transition in Canada is dead. It's just going to take a lot longer, and it's going to need ongoing support all the way upstream to the mines for it to evolve, given that we don't have that, let's just say, the same mindset in the US of going down that path as well. Because the reality is, if we keep an orientation towards electrification in Canada, then one has to wonder where those vehicles are going to come from. They're probably likely going to come from overseas somewhere, because I think in the US, there's not going to be a lot of incentive for vehicle manufacturers, importers there to load up their inventories with EVs, given the new regulatory regime that's been outlined there.
A question from the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce. What structural changes are automakers making to adapt to the trade uncertainty, and how can mid-sized manufacturers better position themselves to remain integrated in future production platforms?
That's a good question. Well, there are, I think, at least three of my members, for instance, when the tariffs were imposed, made the choice not to import vehicles, certain vehicles that were built in the States, into Canada, just because in some cases those vehicles might not have been uh, CUSMA or USMCA compliant. And additionally, because because of that, if they have to pay the full tariff, then they just couldn't be competitive in the marketplace anymore. So, you think about, I don't know, some mid-sized SUV. All of a sudden, you have your vehicle is now 25, perhaps not the entire 25% more expensive, but uh, certainly more expensive than what your competitors would be in the marketplace, and you're just not going to sell any of those. So I think in two or three instances, I'm aware of vehicles that just weren't brought forward into the Canadian market, which reduces choice for Canadian consumers. In other instances, some companies, some of my Korean members, have suggested, well, okay, well, we make a same vehicle in Korea, so we're going to just reorient our um, our, our orientation towards our inventory supply from Korea instead of from the United States. And because of the trade agreements that Canada has, Canada, Korea, the CPTPP trade agreement, Canada, Japan, those vehicles come into the Canadian marketplace duty free. So there's been a number of instances of that as well. And I think for the manufacturers here, my members, principally Honda and Toyota, they've been working closely with the federal government on the whole emissions framework, which is, simply saying that, you get tariff relief on your inputs based on the number of vehicles that you're producing here in Canada, to try and encourage more production, or not penalize production in Canada, if you will. And I think for the SME aspect of things, I was part of the trade mission that recently took place down in Mexico, and there were um, number of Canadian SME businesses down there, not just in the auto space, but just looking to really uh, cultivate that relationship with Mexico on the same continent that already has the supply chain, and transportation and logistics framework set up that could facilitate greater trade between Canada and Mexico as well. So it's not I don't think it's an easy road to hoe for anybody. The environment is significantly more complex than it was, 14 months ago, with all of the tariffs that have been put in place, and all of the other geopolitical tensions. But the automotive industry is pretty resilient, and there's a lot of people spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to optimize their supply chains, and figure out how they can continue to run their businesses, and at the same time not pass any more costs than is necessary onto end consumers.
Okay, we're just a little bit past one, so we'll conclude with a short and sweet one from Yufei. I guess it's in relation to the current environment, but given that, will Canada work towards its own brand of cars?
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of articles have been written about that. I think it's a nice aspiration. I think for Flavio Volpe, head of the Parts Manufacturers Association, who developed the Aero vehicle, I think that's the best demonstration of that, which is not to necessarily build a Canadian vehicle, but as a true example of Canadian ingenuity and capability and developing all of the parts and components necessary for a vehicle, but not developing our own vehicle. I think that's a bit of a bridge too far in my mind, but uh, we'll see. Would be nice, I think, but I think it's a bit of a pipe dream.
Thank you very much, David, on behalf of my colleagues at MITL and also our pretty extensive audience today. Very topical discussion today. Lots of interesting content in the Q&A. So really appreciate your time today, and certainly look forward to see what develops in the future.
Right. Well, thanks very much for having me, Mark. I appreciate it, and thanks to all who joined in today. Appreciate your time as well.
Thank you very